The kind of argument I make is an historical scientific argument using a method that Darwin himself used, known as inference to the best explanation. Some people want to say, well, intelligent design isn't science because it invokes an unobservable or immaterial entity, a mind or an intelligence. But if they say that, then they would also have to acknowledge that the case for Darwinism is also inadequate, is not scientific, because we're using the very same method of reasoning that Darwin himself used. And in any case, science often infers unobservable entities in order to account for things we can't observe. That's just the way science works. It happens all the time in particle physics, and Darwin himself inferred unobservable past events and transitional intermediates in the fossil record, and yet his theory has been accorded scientific status.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Midnight Mormons. I am joined in the studio with Brad Whitbeck and Kwaku L., and we are back on the phone with Stephen C. Meyer, author of Return of the God Hypothesis, also the author of Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. Phenomenal books on intelligent design. Now that we've all figured out that evolution basically failed at explaining everything, avenues have opened up for some really serious academic and uplifting and amazing conversations on what you, Stephen, call intelligent design. That seems to be the label that we're slapping on this thing. Talk to us about intelligent design, and then tell us why your book is the best book about it.
Well, I won't speak to that second question, but I'll tell you why I think it's true. How about that?
Sure.
That works.
Intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of life in the universe that are best explained by the activity of a designing intelligence rather than an undirected process, such as in the biological realm, the process of mutation and natural selection. We were talking a bit in the previous segment about the problems with the contemporary neo-Darwinian view of things. One of the big problems that has been posed to the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism is the discovery that at the foundation of life, in every cell of every living organism, there is digital information stored in the DNA molecule. And this DNA molecule is it stores information in a form very much like a computer code. Richard Dawkins, the great neo-Darwinian advocate in the UK, has said that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Bill Gates has said it's like a software program. Now, think about that in terms of what has to happen to generate a new form of life according to modern Darwinism. The idea is that you would have a gene, a section of genetic code. There would be a random change to the letters in the genetic code, what are called the nucleotide bases, and that would then cause the gene to code for or direct the construction of a different type of protein. And then if you got enough of the right new types of proteins, they might congeal in some way to form a new structure and eventually organ, tissue, or body plan. Well, here's the problem. Think about the analogy to computer science. If you've got a section of functioning code in a computer and you start randomly changing the zeros and ones, are you more likely to degrade that information or to build something fundamentally new? Or to think of it even in another way, if you start randomly changing those zeros and ones and you keep changing them, are you going to build a fundamentally new program or operating system, or are you going to fall into a non-functional abyss?
Yeah.
And computer scientists know this right away. People who write code, they laugh when I pose this as a question. Well, the same problem obtains or applies to the DNA. If you start changing the A's, G's, and T's, the letters in the genetic text, on a random basis, you may get a few small-scale changes that are viable, maybe even slightly advantageous to the organism. But if you change too many, you're going to destroy the function of that gene long before it builds a new protein or biological structure. And this has been tested experimentally in a laboratory. There's an Israeli scientist, Dan Tawfik, who's done work on protein-to-protein evolution, and he's shown that anywhere between 3 and 15 random changes to a section of DNA is enough to completely degrade the stability of the protein that you start with long before you ever get a new fundamentally different and fundamentally different protein structure. And so 3 to 15 mutations is nothing when you consider that the average gene is at least 1,000 characters in length. So this is a real problem. Where does the new information come from? Darwinism has not answered that problem, but that's precisely the problem and the challenge that intelligent design speaks to.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Uh-huh. And the thing that is coming to mind for me is when I've had discussions about scientific arguments like this with people that I know, it tends to come back to the way that I've heard it talked about is the infinite monkey theorem. Are you familiar with by that phrasing?
Well, sure. That's the monkey sitting at the typewriter,
Uh-huh.
typing away for an infinite amount of time,
Uh-huh.
and then eventually the monkey will stumble, you think, on the sequence you need.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually do the math of this, it turns out that that's not true.
Yeah.
That it's got a technical name. It's called the problem of combinatorial inflation.
Uh-huh.
If you take a section of DNA long enough to build an average length protein. Average length protein is about 300 amino acids long. That would correspond to roughly 900 of those genetic letters. And then you realize you've got a 1 in 4 chance of getting the right letter at each place. The number of possible combinations is so vast in comparison to just that one thing you're looking for that you've got a massive needle in a haystack problem, where even the entire history of the planet does not give you enough opportunities to search for the needle you're looking for, the functional sequence that is going to confer some advantageous benefit to an organism. And I've done the math on this in Darwin's Doubt. I did a similar kind of calculations in my first book, Signature in the Cell. And the basic moral of the story is that the functional sequences are so rare in comparison to all the other possible sequences that a random search through the space of all the possible sequences is not likely to give you even one new functional gene or protein in the entire history of life on Earth, let alone the multiple proteins you would need to service even a new cell type in building something like a Cambrian animal.
Oh, wow.
So this is the reliance on the random monkey at the typewriter or pure random mutation to generate those innovations is not mathematically plausible.
That is awesome, and that is such a more sophisticated way to say what my response has been, which is when they actually did a study with this and threw in a monkey with the typewriter, it didn't take long for the monkey to just break the typewriter down, you know?
Just get angry with it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I love that you have a mathematical proof for that too, though, because like we just don't have the amount of time to have made that happen. That's so cool.
Okay.
There's actually some very sophisticated probabilistic reasoning involved in this, showing that it's overwhelmingly more likely that a random search, even complemented with natural selection, will fail in finding a new gene or protein in the time since the beginning of life on Earth than it is that such a mechanism would succeed. So if it's overwhelmingly more likely to fail than succeed, then the best explanation, the best hypothesis, is that mechanism is not responsible for the origin of the information needed to build new proteins. And proteins are just the subunits of cells, or important subunits of cells, but they don't by themselves an animal make. So this is, the problem of body plan, what's called body plan morphogenesis, the building of whole new forms of life, and is well beyond the creative power of that mutation selection mechanism. And yet, and this is the thing I wanted to add before, we do know of a cause that is capable of generating information. In our experience, whether we're looking at computer code or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal or information in a hieroglyphic inscription, think of any kind of digital or alphabetic or hieroglyphic information, it always comes from an intelligent source. And so the discovery of information at the foundation of life and even the simplest living organisms suggests the activity of a designing mind. We know of no other cause in the universe for information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, such as we find it in DNA.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you're challenging basically the most fundamental premises of evolution as being inadequate to be able to explain something as simple as the human species that, now populates the planet, the origins of our very own race, our very own species. Evolution couldn't do it, but you say creative design or intelligent design can do it. So what are your big proofs? Everybody's always like, show me the money. Like Tom Cruise in that one movie with Cuba Gooding Jr. Show me the money. So what's your proof? What's the big evidence in your mind that, okay, I feel 100% settled, both as, a theological person, but as also a scientific person walking into an academic symposium and saying, yeah, I'm a creative, intelligent designisterer, or whatever the correct term is.
Well, we just prefer a design proponent or an intelligent design advocate.
Yeah, that's a lot better than creative, intelligent designisterer. Yeah, that was much better.
But that has some charm too. So, the first thing to say is that science doesn't offer proof in the sense that mathematicians do, where you make a deduction from self-evident axioms to an absolutely 100% certain conclusion. Science makes inferences from data to theories or explanations, and it opts for those explanations which, if true, would best explain the evidence at hand. So you posit something as an explanatory entity to account for the evidence that you see, and then you judge that explanation by reference to, in particular, your uniform and repeated experience of cause and effect. So what we're looking at is an effect. There is, at some point in the history of the planet, life emerged. And all forms of life have inside their cells, they have cells, and inside cells there is an information processing system with DNA, RNA, and proteins. Now, the crucial feature of of the DNA is that it stores information. So a crucial question in trying to explain the origin of the first life, for example, would be what best explains the origin of the information necessary to build the first living cell. And to answer that question, we need to look at the kinds of causes that we see in operation today. This is a standard Darwinian principle of reasoning, which Charles Darwin got from his mentor, Charles Lyell, the great 19th century geologist. When we're trying to explain an event in the remote past, we look for causes, as he put it, that are now in operation. So what kind of cause now in operation generates digital code? That's the question. Mm-hmm. Then to answer that question, you need to look at the look at the competing hypotheses that have been offered. And that's what I do in my books. I look at the materialistic hypotheses, some that have been based on chance, some that are based on chance and natural selection acting in tandem, and some that are based on what are called natural laws or self-organizational principles. Mm-hmm. And I show for various reasons that each of those approaches to trying to explain the origin of information is inadequate, both empirically, that is to say with respect to evidence, and sometimes theoretically. Sometimes those proposals are actually incoherent logically. But then I show that there is a cause which is known from our present experience, our uniform and repeated experience, to have the capability of generating information, and that cause is intelligence. And so then I argue that the best explanation, based on our knowledge of cause and effect, of the origin of information, is a mind or an intelligence. It is the only known cause of that effect that we want to explain. And when we encounter an effect for which there is only one known cause, the most logical thing to infer is that cause was active in producing the effect. So the kind of argument I make is an historical scientific argument using a method that Darwin himself used, known as inference to the best explanation. Some people want to say, well, intelligent design isn't science because it invokes an unobservable or immaterial entity, a mind or an intelligence. But if they say that, then they would also have to acknowledge that the case for Darwinism is also inadequate, is not scientific, because we're using the very same method of reasoning that Darwin himself used. Mm-hmm. And in any case, science often infers unobservable entities in order to account for things we can't observe. That's just the way science works. It happens all the time in particle physics. And Darwin himself inferred unobservable past events and transitional intermediates in the fossil record, and yet his theory has been accorded scientific status. So we think intelligent design is a proper scientific theory that has the status of an inference to the best explanation, which is kind of the most solid grounds you can offer for a theory in science.
Okay, so if I wanted...
But a best explanation.
If I wanted to summarize that, you'd say, just like originally Darwinism stated that life cannot spring forth from non-life, you're saying intelligence cannot spring forth from non-intelligence, and an intelligent designer is the best explanation for the intelligence that we see in even the smallest particles of our existence, our very own cells.
Well, I would say, I put it a little differently, but you're getting warm. I'd say that the information in our experience is always the product of mind, of intelligence, and that we have discovered in a very rigorous sense, a form of informational nanotechnology at work inside living cells. And yet we know of only one cause for the origin of information, especially in a digital form.
Is that nanotechnology the same chips that they had in the vaccine? No, I'm just kidding.
Oh my gosh, Carden.
I was kidding. I said, is that nanotechnology the same microchips that they had in the vaccine? There was this meme.
Now you're trying to poke me into something controversial, whereas intelligent design is thoroughly mainstream, right?
Yeah. All right. So Kwaku's
I would argue it's getting increasingly so, but obviously we've been involved in our own controversial discussions. So
I'm loving it. So Kwaku's going to jump here. I saw him having a question for you.
Yes. So I have a question. I wanted to ask you if there's any possibility you think that life on Earth came from an extraterrestrial source.
Well, I addressed that hypothesis in my new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, because after I wrote Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, both of which books made a positive case for intelligent design, but did not attempt to identify the identity or identify the designing agent responsible. Identifying the identity is redundant, sorry. Anyway, a lot of my readers wanted to know, well, who do you think the designing agent responsible for life is? And I never thought it was a space alien. And I am a theist. I believe in God. And so I had long said that I thought that the evidence for design in biology had theistic implications, but there were other possibilities. So in the new book, I addressed those other possibilities, and one of which is the hypothesis you just enunciated. The idea is sometimes the technical name for it is panspermia, and it was formulated first by no less a personage than Sir Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. And Crick proposed the idea of a space alien designer because he was aware of how difficult the problem of explaining the origin of life on Earth actually was or is. And but obviously the space alien designer hypothesis has a problem, and that is that if you posit an alien intelligence as the source of life on Earth, then you've got to explain, well, how did life arise first on that alien planet and then evolve into the alien? You still are confronted with the origin of the information necessary to build the first life, and the problem isn't solved by simply kicking it out into space. In addition, this alien designer hypothesis does not explain the origin of the universe or the origin of the fine-tuning of the physical parameters that have been present since the very beginning of the universe. Clearly, no being within the cosmos can explain the physical parameters that are necessary for its own subsequent evolution or origin, nor can it explain the origin of the universe in which it resides, because presumably such an agent would have arisen, an alien would have had to evolve long after the beginning. So it's not a good explanation for the other two big facts that I discuss in my book, Return of the God Hypothesis, namely that the universe had a beginning and it's been finely tuned for life since the beginning. So as an overall explanation of those three key facts, the space alien designer hypothesis fails on really all three counts.
But what if the alien's really smart? I'm kidding. No, okay.
The alien can be as smart as you want, but the alien isn't going to pre-exist the conditions that make its life possible. That's the point.
But really smart, though. He's really smart.
It doesn't matter. He's got to be there before the universe exists in order to explain the origin,
So that
the origin of the universe.
In
So
fact,
Stephen
actually,
C. Meyer just endorsed storming Area 51 on Midnight Informants. You heard it here first on FM 98.1. We're going to find that alien, the really, really smart one. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
So I love the way that you tie this back into. I like the way that you put it in your book in the idea of a Goldilocks universe, and the way you tell the story of Fred Hoyle, and how he started atheist, and by the end he's saying like it's almost beyond question that there's an intelligence designer because of the fine-tuning problem that you're talking about here.
A famous quote from Hoyle, he says that a common sense interpretation of physics and chemistry suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed. A common sense interpretation of the evidence suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry. So I often quip that I think it's wonderful the way the monkeys always make it into the origins discussion, even if we're talking about physics. It's not just the guys at the typewriters trying to explain.
And I just wanted to say a quick plug for your book again. I think that the illustrations that you've included in there actually help it be so much more understandable. And so I just wanted to throw that in there as well. So like anyone who's listening or hears this and is like, man, I'm having a hard time following what some of these things are. Just in the book itself, there's so many good diagrams to help make this all make more sense.
Yeah, unfortunately.
I had a 12-year stint as a college professor right after grad school and taught,
Nice.
even freshman courses. So I got really good at stealing my kids' my young children's toys and taking them to the university as visual aids in various. So I do all kinds of gags and visual aids to try to make things clear, and lots of diagrams and PowerPoints, and some of that's reflected in the way I do these books as well. I try to explain the science you need to understand the argument, and even the story of how it was discovered, so that when you get to the argument, you have learned the basics of the science that are relevant to assessing whether the argument is valid or not.
All right. So basically, guys, evolution, neo-Darwinism evolution is so boomer. The new cool is intelligent design, and Stephen C. Meyer wrote the best book on it called Return of the God Hypothesis. Go out, buy it, read it. This is Midnight Mormons on FM 98.1.